Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar titled Lessons from History, the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. There's a few things to note regarding today's webinar. Participants will be muted upon entry and videos turned off. For technical assistance, we ask that you use the chat box. Number 3, you also receive an email in approximately 3 months requesting feedback and impact on this presentation. And lastly, we ask for you to visit us at www.ncdus.org/training to view other training opportunities that we may have. In addition, an evaluation form and slides from today's presentation will be sent out tomorrow morning. We will also have a 10-minute question and answer segment available at the end of this presentation. For any unanswered questions, we'll be able to send you those responses from the presenter by email within 1 week from today's presentation. I'll now introduce today's presenter. Today's presenter is Dr. Tanya Foreman, a professor of psychiatry at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She graduated from the University of Kentucky College of Medicine, and she did an adult psychiatry residency at Vanderbilt University, a child and adolescent psychiatry fellowship at the University of Florida, and a forensic psychiatry fellowship at Yale University. Before coming to UNC in 2017, Dr. Foreman was on the medical school faculties of Tulane University, University of Louisville, and Indiana University. She has won numerous awards, including the Ginsberg Fellowship from the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry and the Rappaport Fellowship from the American Academy of Psychiatry and Law. Her clinical area of focus is eating disorders. I'll now turn things over to Dr. Tanya Foreman.
Hey everyone. Today's talk is called Lessons from History, the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. Michelle, I seem to be locked up.
You might need to, can you go back into the presentation? Okay, probably do presentation, yeah, and let's see if you can.
Okay, there we go. I do have a trigger warning. This presentation contains photographs of people who have undergone semi-starvation. The Minnesota Starvation Study was conducted by Dr. Ansel Keyes at the University of Minnesota in 1945. The participants were 36 men who were conscientious objectors during World War II. The goal of the experiment was to study the effects of starvation. This is Ansel Keyes, the principal investigator of the study. He was an interesting character, and his developmental years laid the groundwork for his later interest in starvation. He was born in 1904 in Colorado Springs to working-class parents. After the Great Earthquake of 1906, his family moved to Los Angeles, where he spent time with his uncle. Keyes' uncle was Lon Chaney, a famous silent film actor who was known as the Man of a Thousand Faces. He was in The Hunchback of Notre Dame and The Phantom of the Opera. Lon's parents, the grandparents of Ansel Keyes, were deaf, and legend has it that Lon Chaney learned to communicate silently by pantomiming with his deaf parents. Ansel Keyes spent much of his childhood in Berkeley, California. His father worked in a print shop, his mother was a housewife, and neither parent had a college education. Young Ansel Keyes was not particularly studious. In fact, he was sort of a rascal. When Keyes was approximately 10 years old, he and 2 friends ran away to Grizzly Peak. He and the pals survived for 3 days by eating only prunes, bacon, and Aunt Jemima pancakes cooked over a campfire. At the age of 15, Keyes ran away from home again. He left a note for his mother and hitched a ride from California to Oatman, Arizona. He got a job in a cave shoveling bat guano into bags to be used by fertilizer manufacturers. He was by himself and had only cold sandwiches to eat. Each morning, a truck brought him fresh food and water and took away his bags of guano. He had no wood to build a fire, no light, no books. Keyes did this for 3 months. After his solitary experience in Arizona, he went back to Berkeley and became more interested in school. 3 months of shoveling bat manure taught him the value of an education. Keyes completed high school, then he went to college at UC Berkeley and graduated in only 3 years with a degree in economics and political science. After college, Keyes got married and became a management trainee at Woolsworth. But neither his job or his marriage was adequately exciting to him, and he left both within a few months. Even though he had never taken a single college biology class, Keyes returned to college, studied day and night, and received a master's degree in zoology in 6 months. He was offered an internship at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. At Scripps, he began studying fish survival in low oxygen water. The goal was to see how oxygen deprivation affected the vertebral development of fish. This research was likely the origin of his lifelong exploration of living in extreme conditions. Keyes received his first PhD and moved to Copenhagen to study. After that, he moved to Cambridge for more education. At Cambridge, Keyes studied with a scientist named Professor Joseph Barcroft. Barcroft became famous researching the effects of cold temperatures on the nervous system. As part of his experiments, Barcroft lay naked on a couch in sub-freezing temperatures for an hour at a time and recorded his impressions in a notebook. With Dr. Barcroft, Ansel Keyes also studied the effects of high altitudes on human physiology. Keyes received a second PhD from King's College in Cambridge. He went on to study altitude at Harvard and then at the Mayo Clinic. In 1938, Ansel Keyes accepted a position at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. His task was to start a new institute, the Laboratory of Physiological Hygiene. Its vague charter was, quote, to try to find out why people got sick before they got sick. Keyes' goal for his research was to study, quote, the exact measurement of human function and the factors affecting human performance and behavior. He didn't have a lack of self-confidence, and he boldly wrote, these are not questions of medicine or physiology or biochemistry or psychology or physical education, but invade and partake of all. The University of Minnesota's athletic department funded some of Keyes' research on the size of the hearts of athletes versus non-athletes. Keyes disproved the prevailing idea that athletes' hearts were bigger than those of non-athletes. He also studied military rations. Let's switch gears for a couple minutes to take a deeper dive into the history of military rations. Napoleon Bonaparte is famously quoted as having said, an army marches on its stomach. For much of history, soldiers had to live off the land or pillage food from citizens or soldiers of the enemy. Malnutrition and disease were major causes of death for soldiers. In 1775, soldiers fighting in the US Revolution received packs including 1 pound of beef, 1/4 pound of pork, or 1 pound of saltfish, 1 pound of bread or flour, 3 pints of peas or beans, 1 pint of milk, 1/2 pint of rice or 1 pint of cornmeal, and 1 quart of spruce beer or cider. During the Civil War, some progress had been made in the preservation of food. Rum rations given during previous wars were eliminated, but Union soldiers' rations included coffee, tea, and seasonings. Soldiers also ate biscuits called hardtack. Hardtack is made of flour, water, and sometimes some salt or sugar. It has an extremely long shelf life if kept dry. In fact, there are some actual Civil War hardtack biscuits on display in museums. During World War I, the military started trying to customize rations depending on the tactical situation. They developed several types of rations. Garrison rations included perishable foods like bread and wheat. Like meat and bread. Trench or emergency rations included beef powder and wheat cakes and a few 1-ounce chocolate bars. Trench rations were kept in large steel cans designed to withstand chemical attacks. Another category was the reserve ration, which were non-perishable and were somewhere between the garrison rations and the trench rations. Reserve rations were meant to supply an entire day of food, and a reserve ration contained a 1 pound can of meat, 2 8-ounce tins of hard bread, 2.4 ounces of sugar, 1 ounce of ground coffee, and 0.16 ounces of salt. But these rations were bulky. As we moved into World War II, the goal became to provide the highest possible caloric value in the smallest possible package. By 1941, it was clear that the next war would require extensive use of airborne soldiers, tank troops, and other small, highly mobile units. The Army contacted Keyes about designing a new paratrooper ration that would be highly portable. Rations evolved and the contents were refined until it became the K ration. The K ration might or might not have been named after Keyes. The final version of the K ration contained 2,830 calories and was packaged by the Wrigley Chewing Gum Factory in Chicago. Breakfast was malted milk tablets, canned veal loaf, and instant coffee. Lunch was dextrose tablets, canned ham spread, and bouillon. Dinner was chocolate, sausage, lemonade, and sugar. The soldiers also received 4 cigarettes. The rations contained approximately 33 grams of protein and were slightly under the daily recommendations for vitamins. The only source of vitamin C was the lemonade powder. And here is a box for a breakfast K ration. By 1944, the Army used the K rations for personnel beyond the paratroopers, and it produced more than 100 million K rations that year. Soldiers became fond of the K rations not only for their food, but also for the packaging. They used the packaging as a drinking cup, a boot insole, and as a way to start fire. The boxes, if they look familiar, you're above a certain age, are actually Cracker Jack boxes. The K rations were important precursors to current day MREs used by the military. Keyes was named a special assistant to the Secretary of War. He became involved with more and more military research, including a study on heat stress and a new way to evaluate physical fitness. He also decided to pursue a study on the effects of starvation. When I talk to people about the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, one of their first responses is often, they starved people in a research study that would never be allowed to happen today. But I think it's important to consider the study in its historical context. World War II began in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. The invasion of Dunkirk was in 1940. The attack on Pearl Harbor was on December 7th, 1941. June 6th, 1944 was the invasion of Normandy, or D-Day. And just a few months later, on November 19th, 1944, Keyes began his starvation experiment. But why? After Keyes' work on military nutrition, it became natural for him to look at the larger issue of world hunger. Keyes persuaded several sponsors that starvation had never been studied in a systematic scientific way. Keyes observed that the history of man is largely a history of the quest for food, but it had never been formally studied. The Minnesota Starvation Study was timely for several reasons. The war was taking a terrible toll on the world's food supplies and was devastating the world's infrastructure for food processing and distribution. Rationing of food was common. There were famines in Europe and Asia, including the Dutch famine of 1944 and 1945. People were concerned that after the war, hungry people could be difficult to manage, and that could be a breeding ground for revolts in communism. And we knew we needed to understand the physical and mental states of concentration camp survivors as we hoped for their release. We also needed to know if there was an optimal way to renourish people. There was a desire to determine whether there was an ideal substance to use for refeeding, i.e. a formula or supplement combination that could be delivered on a mass scale. In the end, Keyes' combination of national security, humanitarian, and scientific arguments was effective. He persuaded people that his study was important and timely. The Starvation Project received funding from the Sugar Research Council, the National Dairy Council, the Office of the Surgeon General, the Athletic Department of the University of Minnesota, and some private industries. He was also given money by historic peace churches. When Ansel Keyes set out to find volunteers for his studies, Americans and people around the world were already used to being asked to make personal sacrifices for the good of others. Posters such as this one encouraged people on the home front to do things to contribute to war efforts. Rosie riveters were asked to step forward and fill jobs that had been previously done by men who were now on the front lines fighting in the war. People were encouraged to grow victory gardens to produce food and ease tension in the food supply chain. So it was into this environment of collective social responsibility that Ansel Keyes set out to find volunteers for his starvation study. And there was a perfect group of candidates, the conscientious objectors. JFK said, "War will exist until that distant day when the conscientious objector enjoys the same reputation and prestige that the warrior does today." Conscientious objectors constituted 1/5 of 1% of American men registered for the draft. There were approximately 12,000 total conscientious objectors during World War II, and most of them came from historic peace churches, which was a blanket designation that included Quakers, Mennonites, and Brethren. Because of their religious or personal beliefs, members of this church would not fight on the battlefront and didn't believe in killing. They were not draft dodgers, though, but unfortunately, they became the brunt of ridicule. The Civilian Public Service, or CPS, was an attempt to deal with the troublesome issue of these idealistic pacifist draftees. The men of the CPS were unpaid by the government, and they were uncompensated in the event of injury or death. However, some of the peace churches did give money to the participants' families. Many of their tasks were demeaning. For example, they literally had to move piles of dirt. And in this cartoon, the caption says, "While the shot and shell are flying and the mighty cannons boom, he is tidying up the trenches with a dustpan and a broom." But some of the things they did were heroic, such as parachuting into forests to fight fires. More than 3,000 CPS workers volunteered in US psychiatric hospitals and reported on the horrific conditions they found there. Some conscientious objectors participated in medical research. For example, 48 CPS guinea pigs, as they were called, were forced to wear lice-infested underwear in order to contract typhus. Others gargled sputum from people with pneumonia. Others strapped mosquito-filled boxes to their stomachs to contract malaria. He's performed several experiments on objectors. He studied the effects of vitamin, both present and absent. He studied the effects of severe cold and severe heat. He exposed the research participants to excessive moisture. He studied the effects of thirst. In 1943, he kept 6 volunteers in bed for a month to study the effects of bed rest. And this is an example of a recruitment poster for his starvation study. He's attempted to appeal to conscientious objectors' desires to perform relief work overseas after the war. Participants were given free tuition to university classes and could participate in a School of Foreign Relief within the lab, where they could learn foreign languages and information that would make them more effective relief workers when the time arrived. The participants of the Minnesota Starvation Experiment ranged in age from 22 to 33. Between 200 and 400 men applied. There's conflicting information about that, but far more people applied to be in the study than were actually accepted to the study. They were not allowed to be married. All men had to have weight that was in certain norms. And there were 4 broad inclusion criteria. Number 1, the men had to be in good physical health. Number 2, they had to be in good mental health. All participants were given an MMPI. For those of you who are psychologists, you will recognize that the first M in MMPI stands for Minnesota. Number 3, they had to have a demonstrated ability to get along well with others under trying conditions. And finally, they were required to have a genuine interest in relief and rehabilitation. So in other words, they had to have a personal sense of responsibility in bettering the nutritional status of famine victims. The average age participant was 25 years old. The average height was 5 feet 10 inches tall, and the average weight was only 152 pounds. This weight was slightly thinner for their height than the population at large. That wasn't intentional. It just turned out that the people who ended up being in the study happened to be rather lean baseline. Each test subject had at least a year of college. Nearly half had college degrees. Their IQ scores were well above average. On the Army's intelligence test, the Army classification test, the research participants scored 2 standard deviations higher than average selective service inductees. So this was a group of bright, thoughtful young men. With regard to informed consent, Keyes cautioned each participant about some possible risks. For example, they were warned that their immunity would decrease and that they would become more susceptible to infectious diseases. There was a long-standing known association between famine and tuberculosis, so all men were warned that they might contract TB. They were tested for TB prior to the experiment, and one man actually did contract tuberculosis near the end of the study. Participants were told that diabetes was intimately related to the nutritional state and that starvation could increase their risk of developing diabetes. They were told that there could be a lethal level of weight loss, estimated to be around 40% of body weight. The outline of the study is that there were 3 months of starvation, during which each man would be brought to his normal weight for his height and build. After that control phase, there were 6 months of semi-starvation, and the final 3 months were a rehabilitation period. What was life like for study participants? This is the stadium of the University of Minnesota campus. The research participants slept in a large room with 2 rows of cots and an aisle running down the middle. There was no privacy. One subject, Daniel Peacock, described it as follows. The showers were all one huge line of showers, no partitions or anything, and the commodes were all open. There was no privacy anywhere. And in a way, it's just as well, because part of being a guinea pig is that they're going to look at everything that they can look at, touch and feel every part of your body in one way or another, at one time or another, for one reason or another. This is Shevlin Hall on the University of Minnesota campus. It is where the participants ate their daily meals. Originally, the study participants were scheduled to eat at the same time as the football players, but that schedule was changed because they didn't want the research subjects to fraternize with the football players. Also, can you imagine being on a semi-starvation diet and watching football players eat? The participants were given 2 meals a day, one at 8 a.m. and another at 6 p.m. On Sunday, they also had a meal at 12:45. The participants were evaluated with multiple tests throughout all phases of the study. Tests included measurement of heart size, total blood volume, hearing and vision tests, and sperm count. The sperm was of particular interest. In addition to measuring the number of sperm, the ejaculate's volume was measured, as was its viscosity, clarity, and pH. The speed and aggressiveness of sperm were graded. Participants had to keep mandatory journals in which they recorded sexual dreams and thoughts. Other tests included multiple labs, EKGs, and tests of strength, dexterity, and endurance. One of the most dreaded parts of the experiment was the treadmill test, during which subjects were pushed to exhaustion. The participants also had to do 15 hours per week of volunteer work. Examples of volunteer work included helping in the lab, doing maintenance, or working in the laundry. One potential activity for the study participants was as a volunteer inside Minneapolis's artificial limb factories. Minneapolis was, and still is, an international leader in the prosthetics industry. During wartime, the need for artificial limbs would have been quite high. So you can imagine that for the conscientious objectors, having the opportunity to help make prosthetic limbs would have appealed to their desire to help others. In addition to the 15 hours of volunteer work, subjects also had to take 25 hours a week of classes in language, sociology, and political science. This was the School of Foreign Relief, a selling point for many participants when they were recruited for the project. The goal of these classes was to learn skills and information that would equip them to travel to Europe and help in post-war relief efforts. Especially during the standardization phase of the experiment, participants had plenty of energy. In their limited free time, they took advantage of community activities. One man ushered for the Minneapolis Symphony Orchestra in order to attend concerts for free. Another man enrolled in graduate level courses at the University of Minnesota. Someone else acted in a campus production of Molière law classes. A main activity and important requirement of each participant during all phases of the study was walking. Participants were required to walk 22 miles a week. At first, they were allowed to walk alone. However, when there were some rule violations, a buddy system was adopted. The study participants became well known around the campus area. Participants were allowed to walk outside or on a treadmill. 2 men developed the following strategy. Roscoe Hinkle and I figured out we'd take the 11-mile walk every Sunday night, and then we had half of our walking done, and the rest of the week was no problem at all. In contrast to some who suddenly on Saturday night are walking on the treadmill for hours to get in the time. So now that we talked about life during the study, let's break it down into the 3 phases. The first part was a 3-month control phase. The goal was to establish a baseline weight for the men in a controlled setting with a predictable amount of physical movement. Dr. Keyes wanted to determine the number of calories necessary for weight maintenance for each man given a constant activity level. Another goal was to establish baseline values for the various tests that they performed again during the subsequent phases. The next part of the experiment was 6 months of semi-starvation. The goal was for each participant to lose approximately 2.5 pounds per week. The amount of food each man received depended on how he was progressing toward his weekly weight loss goal. Additions and reductions to the basic meal plan were usually made in the form of slices of bread, and it was easy for the men to see how their meal plan compared to that of their peers. This created some resentment and tension. It always surprises me to see that the participants in the study, they were allowed to eat slightly more than 1,500 calories a day, and it was still considered semi-starvation. Most of our patients with anorexia eat far fewer calories, often under 1,000 calories a day. Occasionally, I share the information about the study with patients with anorexia, and they are always shocked to learn that they are eating much less than the amount allowed for participants in a starvation study. Sometimes I find it provides a helpful fact-checking opportunity for patients. So this is a graph that was made in the study. And what's important about this graph is that there's a point at which people continue to lose weight, even if their caloric input is about the same. So for these men, it turned out on average to be about 1,500 calories. This is an example of a sample meal during semi-starvation. The semi-starvation phase meals were designed to approximate the food available in European famine areas, with heavy emphasis on potatoes, cabbage, and whole wheat bread. Meat was limited. Here's another sample meal. Each man's weekly meal plan was posted on Friday nights. Some men dreaded seeing the weekly postings and went to a movie on Friday to delay having to see the bad news that their rations were being reduced. Water and cigarettes were allowed in unlimited quantities. Black coffee was also unlimited initially. However, as they lost weight, the men derived extreme pleasure from warm beverages. They started drinking excessive coffee, up to 15 cups a day. Therefore, coffee was limited to 9 cups per day. And for some reason, participants were initially allowed to chew unlimited amounts of gum. One man, James Plower, chewed as many as 40 packs of gum per day. He chewed and spit so much gum that he measured his gum consumption in a beer mug. I have no idea why there was no limit on the gum, since that would have contributed to caloric consumption. Wrigley's gum had been included in many of the military rations, and Keyes did receive funding from the Office of the Surgeon General. So maybe there was a corporate sponsorship effect. That's complete speculation on my part, but I've always found it puzzling that the chewing gum was allowed in this study. Before we talk about specific study findings, I want to point out that, not surprisingly, many of these findings are also what we see in patients with anorexia. It stands to reason that the physiological effects of starvation will be the same, regardless of etiology. I find it fascinating, though, that some of the emotional and behavioral effects are also the same. I believe that at a certain point in starvation, physiology kicks in and affects behavior. So some of what we consider to be eating disorder behaviors or symptoms may simply be secondary to physiology. During the starvation phase, the basal metabolic rate dropped by as much as 50%. The pulse dropped sometimes to as low as 30 or 40. The lowest recorded pulse was 28. Subjects developed low blood pressure, dizziness, and fainting spells. They had frequent urination and constipation. They became hyper-focused on bodily activities such as urination or defecation. The blood work of the subjects showed decreased red blood cells. Their white blood counts decreased by up to 30%. Their nails and hair fell out or grew slowly. Cuts and bruises healed more slowly. The subjects developed thin, rough skin. They felt weak and also had edema. Some experienced ringing in their ears and dizziness. Study participants experienced profound fatigue. One man, Sam Leggs, said, "I was walking along with my buddy. It was deep into the semi-starvation and we were tired. We would look for driveways when we got to a cross street so we wouldn't have to walk up one step to get from the road to the sidewalk. And so we would walk in the gutter for a while looking for a driveway. We were tired and weak. And so we were standing at a corner waiting for a light or something, and a kid came along on a bicycle and he was really moving, pumping away. And I looked at him and said, 'Wow, look at that boy. He's really whizzing.' And then I said to myself, 'I know where he's going. He's going home for supper and I'm not.' And then for a very brief, I hope it was brief moment, I suddenly hated the boy. I hate at this point to remember with horror I could feel such a thing. So utterly irrational, but there it was." In a diary entry from another participant, he wrote about going to a department store with a revolving door. He was too weak to push the door open, so he had to wait for someone to come push it for him. He was also too weak to open the doors to the library. He had to, quote, "wait until somebody let me scoot in after." Subjects developed increased tolerance for hot food and beverages. They wanted their food heated to high temperatures. This reminds me of what we see with patients being treated for restrictive eating disorders. They're often obsessed with hot drinks, especially tea, and sometimes they become very particular about the temperature at which their food is served. The research subjects spent time lying in the sun. At an eating disorder center where I currently work, patients often lie on the pavement with their arms and legs spread out to maximize the sun exposure, and they call this starfishing. It makes me nervous because I worry about sunburn and dehydration, but many patients are drawn to the pavement to soak up the warmth. Some of the research subjects wanted hats, gloves, and blankets. They wore multiple layers of clothing to stay warm. Think of your patients with anorexia. They often wear multiple layers. I keep blankets in my office because patients are always cold. They wear sweats during the North Carolina summers. I'm sweating and they are freezing. Some of the participants took up smoking. This is a dexterity test. During the starvation phase, cognitive abilities decreased. People had poor concentration. They had more trouble sitting through the required classes. They reported sleep problems. Subjects had to repeat the MMPI several times during the experiment. Most of them had higher deviations on the neurotic scale after 6 months of starvation than they did at the beginning of the study. And these MMPI changes have been called semi-starvation neurosis. The participants had decreased libido and fewer erections. And what about all the sperm that were studied? Their motility decreased and they could not swim as long. There was a buddy system for all activities due to a risk of cheating. Therefore, anybody who wanted to go on a date had to take a buddy with him. Fortunately, everybody's libido took a nosedive and interest in dating declined. A participant named Harold Blickenstaff said, "If you went to a movie, you weren't particularly interested in the love scenes, but you noticed every time they ate and what they ate." Although none of the participants had eating disorders prior to the study, they became preoccupied with food. They developed behaviors that we also see in patients with restrictive eating disorders. For example, some men became obsessed with cookbooks and food. By the end of the study, one man had accumulated nearly 100 cookbooks. Some even planned to open a restaurant after the study ended. Several newspapers became interested in the research study. An article in the Minneapolis Star-Journal told of an incident in which one of the research subjects was, quote, walking past a bakery and was so tempted by the rich odors wafting from the place that he rushed in about a dozen donuts. He gave them to the children in the street and watched with relish as they ate them. The participants developed unusual behavior at the table. Plate licking became common. Some men held their food and coddled it like a baby. They tried to prolong meal times. For example, They diluted their mashed potatoes with water to make it seem like more food that took longer to eat. They called this practice souping. They drenched everything in water to increase the volume, and this also led to excessive urination. They held their food in their mouth for long periods of time. They started eating the components of their meals in a rigid order. One day, a dignitary came to visit the subjects and have a meal with them. A green pea fell onto the floor. Even though they had a distinguished guest, the conscientious objector dropped to the floor, picked up the pea, and ate it without missing a beat. Many men became obsessed with salt. One man, Samuel Legg, developed a habit of heaping all the food on his plate into one pile. He then salted and peppered it until it was crusty with seasoning, and then he ate it. The study participants were aware of their unusual table behaviors. One wrote, "Several of us got talking about how people play with their food. Men paw over the food, shove it from one side of the plate to the other, spend gobs of time making sandwiches, continue to jump up and down, fixing this and getting that." If you have ever eaten a meal with a patient with anorexia nervosa, this description sounds very familiar. Several men tried to distract themselves from thinking about food by taking up new hobbies, including collecting and hoarding books, clothes, and trinkets. One man wrote, "I've been wondering just why I want to buy books so much lately. I've always liked to look at books, but now I seem to want to go further and actually acquire them. I find I'd like to buy clothes too, some things that I really don't need. Not being able to buy food whenever we want to may have something to do with this." Many subjects became irritable as starvation progressed. A participant named Marshall Sutton observed, "We were impatient waiting in lines if we had to, and we'd get disturbed with each other's eating habits at times. I remember going to a friend at night and apologizing and saying, 'Oh, I was terrible today, and let's go to sleep with other thoughts in our minds.'" This is Sam Legg. As the study progressed, he demonstrated unusual behavior. He started collecting cookbooks and reading recipes. He stared at pictures of food with pornographic interest. He was agitated in the meal lines. When a cafeteria worker dropped her serving spoon and had to go back to the kitchen to get another one, Legg started smashing his tray on the counter, swearing. Legg had previously been an unofficial leader of the group, and the other subjects became worried about his deterioration. Loneliness and isolation are major consequences of starvation. As people become more obsessed with food, other interests and relationships suffer. As Harold Blickenstaff, a participant in the Minnesota study, put it, "I don't know many other things in my life that I look forward to being over with any more than this experiment. And it wasn't so much because of the physical discomfort, but because it made food the most important thing in one's life. Food became the one central and the only thing really in one's life. And life is pretty dull if that's the only thing. Every time I have a new patient with an eating disorder, I ask him or her what they like to do for fun. More times than not, the patient responds by saying, 'I don't know,' or they identify something they used to like to do but no longer enjoy. Food restriction robs people of all the other important aspects of life." From a chronological standpoint, the war in Europe ended in May 1945, at the beginning of the 13th week of starvation. Although this was great news for the world, it did not allow Ansel Keyes time to complete his study in order to coincide with the release of prisoners from concentration camps. And that negatively affected the morale of the research subjects. They had been motivated to enroll in the study to help efforts after the war, but the war in Europe ended while the subjects were still starving. Several times, the men were asked to complete an inventory of 50 complaints, as Keyes and his assistants attempted to quantify the misery of the subjects. As the study progressed, the average number of complaints rose from 6.6 to 15. Tiredness, decreased libido, and decreased comprehension were among the most frequent complaints. In order to boost morale, Keyes allowed a feast meal during the 15th week of starvation. The men voted on the items, and the meal included grapefruit juice, bacon, gravy, biscuits, ham, bread with butter and honey, and an orange. The meal provided 2,366 calories. The atmosphere at the meal was happy and lighthearted. However, at the end of the meal, the men realized that they would have to starve again. They looked at their plates and could not bear to leave one edible item on the plate. All that remained was an orange peel. Each man picked up the peel and ate every bit of it. Keyes was furious when he found out because the peel had not been part of his caloric calculations. Despite being angry about the orange peel, Ansel Keyes worried about how the study was affecting the subjects. One participant reported, "Mrs. Keyes said that Dr. Keyes went through terrible times during the experiment as we lost weight and became gaunt and so on. And he would come home and say, 'What am I doing to these young men? I had no idea it was going to be this hard.'" Here's Dr. Keyes measuring the chest of James Plower. Plower was eventually thrown out of the experiment for cheating. When he didn't lose the expected amount of weight, Plower was confronted about cheating. He finally admitted that he ate a sandwich he found on the ground, stole a student's lunch and ate it, and had been eating garbage routinely. Another man who was removed from the study was Franklin Watkins. Before the buddy system was implemented, he cheated by eating ice cream and rutabagas. He was disturbed by dreams about cannibalism. His money was taken away, so he couldn't purchase extra food. So he started shoplifting food. He started challenging the experiment during conversation with peers. He asked, "What are we really accomplishing here?" He was confronted by Keyes. He started crying and said he was a failure. Then he said he was going to kill himself and he threatened to kill Keyes. He was taken to the psychiatric ward of the university's hospital. Keyes was not sympathetic. He wrote in the chart that Watkins was, quote, "a bisexual with poor personality integration and weak self-control." The diagnosis of bisexuality was based only on MMPI results and Watkins' earlier admission that he had once had a beautiful friendship with a man years before. This is Henry Schulberg, and he successfully completed the study. In fact, he's the subject who acted in a Molière play during the experiment. Schulberg feared that his hunger and decreased concentration would cause him to flub his lines. In reality, he delivered, in French, a convincing performance. His lines included the following: "I have her alone in my thought. She has all my devotion, all my desires, all my joy. I speak only of her, I breathe only for her, and here is the fit reward for so much love." As he received applause, Schulberg was not dreaming of a lost romantic love. He had been thinking of fresh bread, blueberry pie, and curry dishes. Here is Sam Legg again. He was in the rehabilitation phase, but still had his food controlled. The week before, he had dropped a car on his hand while he pretended to do some maintenance. He crushed a finger. Doctors were suspicious, but allowed him to remain in the study. He befriended some elderly women during one of his walks. He went to visit them one day, but they were eating. He couldn't eat the meal, but he enjoyed the company. While they ate, he went outside to chop wood. He was chopping wood and heard people laughing and scraping plates inside. He imagined slicing through meat. As he chopped the wood, he put his left hand on the flat top of a log and cut off 3 fingers. When he got to the hospital, he told the staff member at the hospital he was in a starvation study, and she said, but you didn't have to do it that way. According to Legg, she thought I had eaten them. I was hungry. I didn't actually. They're now buried in a backyard in Minneapolis. Keyes went to see Legg in the hospital to kick him out of the study. Legg begged to stay in the study and said, "Keep me in for the hungry. For the rest of my life, people are going to ask me what I did during the war. This experiment is my chance to give an honorable answer to that question." He was allowed to stay in the experiment, and his rehabilitation phase meals were brought to him in paper Chinese food boxes. When asked whether the incident had been an accident or not, Legg said he could not say that it was, and he could not say that it wasn't. After 6 months of semi-starvation, participants entered a 3-month rehabilitation phase. Initially, there was a period of restricted rehab, during which subjects were split into several groups and given different meal plans to determine the best rations to use for refeeding. The information from this part of the study is not particularly helpful because the calories were still fairly low, approximately 2,200 calories in the lowest group, and there was not much difference in each group's meal plan. Keyes recognized that people needed more calories than expected to begin to gain weight. Therefore, he deviated from his plan and increased the meal allowance by an average of 800 calories per group. At a conference in 1945, Keyes said, "Enough food must be supplied to allow tissues destroyed during starvation to be rebuilt. Our experiments have shown that in an adult man, no appreciable rehabilitation can take place on a diet of 2,000 calories a day. The proper level is more like 4,000 daily for some months. The character of the rehabilitation diet is important also, but unless calories are abundant, then extra protein, vitamins, and minerals are of little value. Most of the men participated in the controlled rehab phase that lasted for 12 weeks. At the end of 12 weeks, the mean BMI of the participants was 18.4, which was still well below their baseline weights. After the 12-week controlled rehab, most participants left, but 12 stayed for another 8 weeks to be monitored while they ate without restriction. Most men reported still feeling hungry after eating. One participant, Henry Schulberg, had to be taken to the hospital to have his stomach pumped because he ate so much. Another man threw up on the bus. He ate and ate but could not get full. His stomach was like a bottomless pit. During the first 2 weeks of unrestricted refeeding, most men ate up to 11,000 calories of food per day. In fact, they ate so much that Keyes reinstituted some dietary limits. The extremely high appetites lasted for a few weeks for most participants, and then their intake leveled off at around 3,200 to 4,500 calories per day. Once the subjects were given liberal access to calories, the participants gained weight rapidly, but they gained body fat more rapidly. The takeaway message was that fat goes back on before muscle. Therefore, people needed to gain even more weight to rebuild muscles and organs. To summarize, body fat dropped significantly and rapidly during starvation, and fat came back on first during refeeding. At 8 months follow-up, the abdominal body fat was 40% higher than pre-study, and then it started dropping. The further out from the end of the study, the less valuable the data is because it was not available for all participants. A year after the study ended, weight data was only available for 8 men. Their body fat was still somewhat above their baselines. Most of the subjects ended up being heavier than their baselines for more than a year. On average, they weighed 116% of control weights a year after the study. 3 men never returned to their baseline weights. This raises the question of whether the body might increase its set point after starvation. So think of yo-yo dieting. People restrict, then they eat, then they gain fat, then they restrict, then they eat, then they gain more fat, then they restrict. Each time, they may end up with more body fat and less lean tissue. In October of 1945, Keyes published a 48-page report entitled Experimental Starvation in Man. At the time of the report's publication, the men were just in the rehabilitation phase, so there wasn't much practical information that Keyes could provide for the World War II relief workers. Keyes did some specific investigation on anorexia nervosa. He obtained the 1895 autopsy of a 16-year-old girl who weighed 49 pounds when she died from anorexia. Keyes observed that the Minnesota Starvation Experiment actually more closely duplicated anorexia than wartime starvation because in anorexia, conditions other than food intake, such as cleanliness and accessibility to medical care, were normal. When given what it needs after starvation, the body stores fat first and then builds muscle. Therefore, in treating anorexia, people's weight might need to be restored above pre-starvation weight in order for full repair of muscles and organs. Keyes said that the most significant finding of his study was that the human body is well equipped to deal with starvation and that it is extremely resilient. He thought that the body was more able to tolerate the effects of starvation than the mind is. It was hoped that there might be an optimal blend of nutrients that would help a person recover from starvation. What Keyes learned, however, is that no protein or vitamin supplement makes much difference on the rate or degree of recovery. In protein-deprived situations, a protein supplement might be helpful, but basically, according to Keyes, the relatively high cost providing special protein feedings as compared with the cost of supplying additional calories far outweighs any possible advantage. He continued, calorie intake is the single nutritional element of highest importance in rehabilitation feeding a person starved on a European type of famine diet. So in other words, food is the best way to refeed someone who has been starving. Relief workers were also prepared to treat concentration camp survivors with nasogastric tubes or IV fluids based on a belief that their digestive tract would be too deteriorated to function properly. But Keyes demonstrated that using the digestive tract was best. He said, "The vast majority of the famine victims could take nourishment in my mouth without any special difficulty. And this is what we know about treating patients with anorexia. Unless there is a medical reason that prohibits the use of the GI tract, refeeding can be done by mouth. NG tubes are generally not necessary." This was published in 1950. It is a huge 2-volume summary of the starvation experiment. And here's the citation for it. So what happened to our friend Ansel Keyes? He went on to have a productive scientific career, and most of his fame had nothing to do with the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. Here he is on the cover of Time magazine in January 1961. The article discussed Keyes' novel theory that cholesterol is linked to heart disease, but mentions nothing of the starvation experiment. Keyes became a proponent of the Mediterranean diet and was the author of the 7-country study. The study looked at the diets and coronary health of residents of European countries with low rates of cardiac disease. Keyes' wife, Margaret, was his longtime collaborator. They co-authored 3 books, 2 of which were bestsellers. They had 3 children. One child as a psychologist, another as a cancer researcher. His 3rd child, Martha, was killed by a robber in 1991 at the age of 42. Ansel Keyes died in November 2004 at 100 years old. If there are heroes in this story, it is these men. These are some of the participants in the Minnesota Starvation Study. After the experiment was over, many of them went on to have distinguished careers serving others. 7 of them participated in Heifers for Relief, a program that delivered livestock to post-war Europe. The volunteers cared for the animals during the boat journey across the Atlantic Ocean. Samuel Legg worked with the American Friends Service Committee to raise money for food to be sent to Germany. He also spent time in France and Switzerland with the Quakers. A participant named Robert McCullough went to Yale Divinity School and then worked on campus ministries. Robert Vilcock went to the University of Chicago Divinity School, and William Anderson became an ordained minister working in South Africa, Mozambique, and Kenya. Max Kempelman had a career in diplomacy and headed the US delegations to the Geneva negotiations on nuclear and space arm reductions in 1974. Other participants became professors and teachers. Could the Minnesota Starvation Experiment be conducted today? Some might argue that its risks were unknown, so the subjects could not give true informed consent. But that's always true to some extent with research. Some might argue about the quality of consent, since all of the participants had been compelled by the Selective Service to do something, and they chose to enroll with the Civilian Public Service. However, there are many alternative activities they could have done in the CPS. Years after the experiment ended, the test subjects almost always said they would volunteer to do it again. Wesley Miller reported, "It's colored my whole life experience, and it was one of the most important things I ever did." We'll leave the last words to Sam Legg, the man who cut off his fingers. I think probably most of us are feeling we did something good and are glad we did it, and that helps us live a better life. If you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend this book. It's well-researched, has many colorful details, reads like a novel, and is a source for much of the information in this presentation. And then here are a couple of other references that were quite useful as I was preparing these slides.
Thank you so much, Dr. Foreman, for that presentation. I know we'll now open up for questions that were posed by the participants in today's webinar. As a reminder, we will send the evaluation and the slides from today's presentation tomorrow morning, and any unanswered questions will be sent to you by email within 1 week from today. So the first question we have asks, is there a hypothesis for why the preference for hot beverages, thermoregulation, something else?
I don't know if Keyes had a hypothesis. I think patients are cold and it makes them feel warm. Although, and I'm not speaking now with regard to this study, I'm just speaking as a result of working with patients with eating disorders for so long. People with eating disorders tend to develop interesting relationships with fluids. Sometimes they restrict their fluids, but sometimes they drink excessive amounts of fluids just to kind of fill up. There's also on the pro anorexia websites, there are all kinds of tips and tricks. And one of them is to have very hot food or very hot drinks to speed up your metabolism. This is not scientifically based. This is just lore on those sites. Sometimes people do it for the caffeine because it gives them energy. But if I had to try to make a scientific hypothesis, I imagine it's just simply because they're so very cold and just can't get warm.
Thank you so much for that response, Dr. Foreman. The next question asks, is it helpful to share this study with patients who have eating disorders?
I've done it sometimes very carefully, and I would never do it with somebody that I don't know well. I would only do it if we had been working together for a while and had a good relationship, and that I thought that sharing the information would kind of help them with some fact checking. I gave you a trigger warning at the beginning of the talk. Looking at the photographs are disturbing. And so if I talk to a patient about the study, I work in a residential setting and an inpatient setting, I always ask them not to go talk to their peers about it, because the last thing I want to do is walk into the milieu and see people with pictures of the Minnesota Starvation Study pulled up on the computer, because the photographs and some of the information in the study could be very upsetting to people. But for the right patient, I think sharing with them the fact that 1,500 calories is what was permitted in a semi-starvation study can be rather helpful.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Foreman. The next question asks, thank you for sharing this in detail. Is there any possibilities to read about this study in the details like you gave us?
Yes, that Todd Tucker book. The Todd Tucker and this one, The Great Starvation Experiment, is just filled with juicy details that talk about the history of the time and about some of the men. And then the citations that I gave also reference some information that was gathered, I think 57 years maybe after the study was over. They were able to contact many of the study participants who were still alive, and they interviewed them. And so some of the quotes came from the recollections of those men. I don't know what happened to all the diaries. All the participants had to keep diaries during the study. I would love to know where those are. As far as I know, there's no museum or necessarily an archive or anything. But if you go on YouTube, there are also a few YouTube videos about the Minnesota Starvation Study, and I think there are a few clips of some of the participants in their later years talking about what it was like to be in this study.
Okay. Thank you once again, Dr. Foreman. Our next question asks, how is this study informing treatment of bulimia and binge eating disorder in addition to anorexia?
I don't know specifically how it would inform bulimia. I think for binge eating disorder, it really reinforces that when we try to restrict what we eat, the body does kind of keep track of that, and it will come back even sometime later and try to have us make up for what we didn't get. So for people with, binge eating disorder, or people who have eating disorders where they restrict most of the day and then they binge later in the day, I think it does demonstrate that the body does try to get its nutrition, even if it comes out in an out of control form. I think probably the most important takeaway from this, though, is that fat comes back on first. And if you've ever worked with patients who are undergoing a nutritional rehabilitation process, they may develop what we sometimes call a refeeding tummy. You know, the fat, the abdominal fat is often the first thing that comes back on. And that seems sort of like a cruel trick of nature, because that's probably the one part of the body that's the most distressing for people. And there have been times when patients have developed a refeeding tummy, and we do talk about it because it's truly there. And I think sometimes it is important to be honest with patients, because as they develop insight, they realize that their perceptions about their body are not accurate. And if they have a refeeding tummy and they come in and say, look at my belly, it's sticking out. If it is a refeeding tummy, sometimes I have said to patients, you know, there is this physiological thing that happens for people sometimes. So I think probably the main applicability to all the eating disorders from this study is what it teaches us about the physiology of starvation and how the body later compensates and may reset the set point.
Thank you so much, Dr. Foreman. We have 2 questions left, but since we're at time, I just wanted to reiterate, we have a few folks that are asking for the name of the book and the citations. We'll be sure to include those in the email, and I'll have Dr. Foreman is sharing it right now. So we'll be sure to include the name and the title along with the references that Dr. Foreman shared in today's presentation with the email that we send tomorrow. Thank you once again for your time, Dr. Foreman. This presentation was truly great. We thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining today. You're
Thank
welcome.
you so much. Bye.
Bye.